Hash 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 asterisk asterisk Part 1 Red Wind and Silver Dust asterisk asterisk. The wind in the Arizona Territory had a name for every season, but in the late summer of 1878, it only knew how to speak of thirst. It was a red wind, born in the distant painted desert, and it scoured the town of Dry Cedar with a fine grit that settled in the lines around a man's eyes and the bottom of his empty cup. It carried the scent of sun-baked creosote and the bitter dust of the silver mine that was the town's heart and its curse. Dry Cedar was a town of sharp edges and unfinished business. It clung to the base of a gray mesa like a stubborn burr, its dusty main street a scar on the parched earth. The promised railroad had stalled 100 miles east, leaving its skeletal tracks to rust in the heat. Law was what Sheriff Pike said it was, and Sheriff Pike was what Silas Crook paid him to be. The only steady rhythms were the clang of the blacksmith's hammer and the groan of wagon wheels biting into gravel, sounds that measured out a life of hard labor and fleeting hope. In the center of it all, in the sun-bleached square, stood the gallows. Its rope, thick and pale as a dead snake, swayed in the red wind, a constant, patient reminder of the town's brutal grammar. Clara Whitlow, 24 and a widow for 6 hard months, felt the grit of that wind on her skin as she walked toward the general store. It was a poor substitute for the touch of her husband, David. She was a woman of straight lines, a straight spine, a direct gaze, and a way of speaking that some found unsettling in a world that preferred its women soft and curved. She had come west with David for the promise of silver, for a life they could build with their own hands. Now, all she had was a small, clean room at the boarding house, a handful of books she'd carried across the country, and a simmering conviction that her husband's death was no accident. The mine officials called it a fall, a misstep in the dark belly of the earth. Clara called it murder. David had been a good man, better than most. He had a quiet strength and a mind that saw numbers and patterns where others saw only rock and dirt. He'd seen the patterns in Silas Crook's books, and he'd been foolish enough, or brave enough, to speak of them. 2 days later, he was dead. The bell above the door of Crook's Mercantile jingled, a frail sound against the wind. The store smelled of canvas, coffee beans, and the faint, cloying sweetness of the patent medicines Crook pushed on the hopeful and the desperate. Silas Crook himself stood behind the counter, a man built thick and solid like a vault. His smile never reached his cold, calculating eyes. He owned the mine, this store, and most of the souls in Dry Cedar. "Mrs. Whitlow," he said, his voice smooth as oiled leather. "Come for your weekly provisions. Some flour and beans, Mr. Crook, and to see if there's any mail. The stage is late. This drought makes for slow going." He looked her over, a flicker of something possessive in his gaze. "It's a hard life for a woman alone. You ought to consider finding a new protector." "I'm managing," Clara said, her voice clipped. She refused to show him any weakness. Her grief was her own, not a commodity for him to assess. As Crook measured out the flour, the door opened again. The wind swirled in, bringing with it a man who seemed to be carved from the very mesas that surrounded the town. He was Dine, or Navajo, as the white men called his people. He moved with a silence that was startling in a town of heavy boots and loud talk. His face was all angles and shadows, his black hair tied back with a simple leather thong. But it was his eyes that held you dark, impossibly clear, and missing nothing. They were the eyes of a hawk that sees the mouse twitch in the grass from 1,000 feet up. He wore denim trousers and a plain cotton shirt, but around his neck hung a small leather pouch, intricately beaded. It was a corn pollen pouch, a vessel of prayer and protection. A quiet declaration of a world that existed long before Dry Cedar and would exist long after its silver veins ran dry. This was Ashki Yazi. He was a man caught between two worlds. He had scouted for the army, guiding supply wagons and mail coaches through territory he knew better than the lines on his own hand. He understood the white man's contracts and his fickle promises. But his heart remained with the Hozo, the path of beauty and balance his people followed. Now he worked as a guide, a translator, a negotiator, a man whose word was his bond in a land where words were cheap. He gave a slight, formal nod to Crook and stood by the door, waiting. He did not speak. He simply was. The men loitering by the cracker barrel shifted, their prejudice a sour smell in the air. A muttered engine cut through the silence. Ashki's face remained impassive, but Clara saw the muscles in his jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. He was accustomed to the insults, but that didn't make the sting any less sharp. Clara paid for her goods, her chin held high. She felt Ashki's gaze on her for a moment as she left. Not judging, just seeing. It was a strange feeling, to be seen not as a grieving widow or a troublesome woman, but simply as a person standing in the red dust. That evening, a knock came at her boarding house door. It was Jed, an old miner with hands like petrified wood and a cough that spoke of too many years underground. He'd been David's friend. He pressed a small, leather-bound notebook into her hand, his eyes darting nervously down the hallway. "David asked me to hold this," he whispered, his voice raspy. "Said if anything happened to him, I was to give it to you when the time was right. I reckon the time is now. Clara, be careful. Crook's got eyes everywhere." He was gone before she could properly thank him. Her hands trembled as she opened the book. Inside, in David's neat, methodical script, was everything. Dates, names, figures. It was a meticulous record of Silas Crook's crimes or shipments that were deliberately underweighed, supply costs that were tripled on the books, wages skimmed from every miner's pay, and at the end, a list of accidents. Men who had questioned the numbers and then found themselves on the wrong end of a falling rock or a frayed rope. David's name was not on the list, but Clara knew he had meant to add it. This book wasn't just proof. It was a testament. It was the justice she had been searching for. A cold fear, sharp and clear, pierced through her resolve. This book was a death sentence. She hid it beneath a loose floorboard under her bed, her heart hammering against her ribs. The weight of it seemed to press down on the entire room. Sleep would not come. She sat by the window, watching the moon rise over the jagged silhouette of the mesa, the town's few lights flickering like fallen stars. Sometime after midnight, she heard it, a faint creak on the stairs, a stealthy footfall in the hall. It wasn't the tired shuffle of a returning miner. This was different. This was a predator's tread. She held her breath, her body rigid. The handle of her door turned slowly, silently. The latch clicked. The door swung inward, framing a hulking shape against the dim light of the hall. A man she recognized as one of Crook's thugs, a brute named Judd, slipped into the room. He moved with a surprising quickness, his eyes scanning the sparse furniture. He wasn't looking for her. He was looking for something else. The notebook. Panic seized her. She was trapped. Her mind raced, but there was nowhere to run, no one to call. Judd's back was to the hallway, his focus entirely on his search. He started with the small dresser, pulling out drawers with rough carelessness. Then a second shadow filled the doorway. It was utterly silent, a column of stillness in the charged air. Ashki Yazi. Clara's breath caught in her throat. He hadn't made a sound, yet his presence was as solid and undeniable as the rock of the mesa. Judd must have sensed him. He stiffened, turning slowly. His hand went to the knife on his belt. He saw the Navajo man standing there, unarmed, his hands loose at his sides. A sneer twisted Judd's lips. "What do you want?" Scout, he growled. "This ain't none of your business." Ashki didn't answer. He simply took one step into the room, blocking the exit. His gaze was flat and hard, holding Judd's with an intensity that seemed to suck the air out of the room. It wasn't a threat of violence. It was a statement of fact. Asterisk, "You will not pass." Judd hesitated. He was bigger, armed, But there was something in the quiet man's posture, an ancient, unyielding strength, that gave him pause. It was the same look a mountain lion gives before it springs a promise of swift, final consequence. He looked from Ashki to Clara, cowering in the corner, and back again. Something shifted in his face, a moment of calculation. Whatever he was being paid, it wasn't enough for this. With a curse under his breath, Judd turned, pushed past the unmoving form of Ashki, and clattered back down the stairs. The silence he left behind was profound. Ashki stood in the doorway for a long moment, his eyes meeting Clara's across the small room. He saw the terror still shaking her, but he also saw the flicker of defiance behind it. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture of acknowledgement, and then he was gone, melting back into the night as quietly as he had appeared. Clara locked her door, her body shaking with the aftermath of fear. The quiet stranger had saved her, for now, but she knew this was only the beginning. Crook would not be deterred so easily. The next day, the trap was sprung. Clara went to the post office, located in a corner of Crook's store, to mail a letter to her sister back east. As she was leaving, Sheriff Pike appeared, his badge glinting on his sweat-stained vest. He was a man whose authority was borrowed, and it sat on him as poorly as his oversized hat. "Hold it right there, Mrs. Whitlow," he boomed, enjoying the attention of the small crowd. He held up a small, empty mail pouch, a registered parcel containing $50 in cash. "Has gone missing from this very counter, and you were the only one standing here." Clara stared at him, bewildered. "That's absurd. I didn't take anything." "We'll see about that," Pike said, grabbing her arm. His grip was surprisingly strong. "You're under arrest for theft of United States mail. A federal offense." He smirked, showing a row of tobacco-stained teeth. "A hanging offense." He said the words loudly, for all to hear. Asterisk, a hanging offense. He dragged her out into the main street, into the glare of the afternoon sun. The townsfolk stopped and stared. Some looked away, their faces pinched with fear. They knew this was Crook's doing. Others watched with a kind of morbid curiosity, their consciences dulled by the daily struggle for survival. She saw May Kincaid, the tough-as-nails owner of the saloon, her face a mask of cold fury, but she was one woman against many. As Pike pushed her toward the jailhouse, Clara's eyes were drawn to the gallows in the center of the square. The red wind caught the rope, making it dance and twist. It looked like it was testing its strength, getting ready. She was being framed, silenced, just like David. But they weren't just going to put her in a shallow grave in the hills. They were going to make an example of her. A public spectacle of what happened to a woman who dared to ask for justice. Across the street, half hidden in the deep shadow of the livery stable, Ashki Yazi watched, his face as still and unreadable as a stone carving. His hand rested on the small corn pollen pouch at his neck, a silent prayer for balance in a world that was falling apart. The wind howled, whipping dust and fear through the streets of dry cedar, and the long, thin shadow of the hanging rope stretched out across the ground, reaching for them all. ###***, Part 2, The Small Town and Its Long Shadow ***. The jailhouse cell was a box made of heat, stone, and the sour smell of old fear. Sheriff Pike shoved Clara inside, the iron door clanging shut with a sound of absolute finality. There was a single high window barred against a sliver of unforgiving blue sky, and a thin mattress stuffed with corn husks that rustled with the memory of every desperate soul who had lain there before her. "Get comfortable, Mrs. Whitlow." Pike's voice oozed through the bars. "Your trial's in 2 days. Crook wants this all neat and tidy, a quick trial, a quick drop. It's a lesson, you see, a lesson for all the other grumbling miners who think they're owed more than they get." He wasn't even trying to hide it. This wasn't about a missing parcel. It was about David's notebook, It was about silencing her and using her death as a gag for the entire town. The door to the outer office slammed shut, leaving Clara in a silence that buzzed with the frantic beating of her own heart. She sank onto the mattress, the rough fabric scratching her skin. For the first time, the true, chilling fear of a death as anonymous and unjust as her husband settled over her. David had fallen into darkness, his voice silenced by a ton of rock. She was being led into the blinding sunlight of the gallows square, to be silenced by a rope. The end was the same. No one would know the truth. The thought was more terrifying than death itself. Should she have stayed silent, kept the book hidden, and tried to slip away? The conflict tore at her, a physical pain in her chest, to die for the truth, or to live with a lie. Outside, the town's long shadow was beginning to stretch across the dust. In the Golden Slipper Saloon, the only establishment in Dry Cedar not owned by Silas Crook, May Kincaid wiped down a glass with a furious energy that made the miners at her bar keep their distance. May was a widow herself, a woman who had buried a husband and carved out a life with nothing but grit and a sawed-off shotgun she kept under the counter. She had a heart buried under layers of cynicism, and she recognized Crook's brand of evil for what it was. She saw Ashki Yazi leading his horse toward the livery. She dried her hands on her apron and intercepted him in the street. "Yazi," she said, her voice low and urgent. "You saw what Pike did?" He stopped, his hawk-like eyes taking in the fury and desperation on her face. He simply nodded. "It's Crook's work. That girl wouldn't steal a penny postcard," May continued. "They mean to hang her. The circuit judge isn't due for another 3 months. Pike is the law here. And Crook owns him. Is there anything you can do? Anything legal?" Ashki considered her words. He knew the white man's law was a tangled net, and men like Crook knew how to pull the strings. "The telegraph," he said, his voice quiet but clear. "A wire to the UNS, Marshall and Prescott." "The line's been down for a week," May scoffed. "Or so the operator says. Funny how it only goes down when Crook needs it to." The legal avenues were closing. Ashki looked toward the jailhouse, then at the gallows. He had sworn an oath to himself after the bitter years of the long walk, the forced march of his people, that he would never again stand by and watch an innocent be led to slaughter. "I will see what can be done," he said. It was not a promise, but a statement of intent. The drought, meanwhile, tightened its grip. The creek that gave the town its name was now just a cracked, muddy scar. The town well was producing more sand than water, and tempers frayed with the heat. The next afternoon, as the women of Dry Cedar gathered at the nearly empty market, the air grew unnervously still. The red dust settled. Then, a low moan started from the south. A swirling column of dirt and debris, a dust devil, rose from the desert floor. It tore across the plain, growing in size and fury, a malevolent spirit of the parched land. It slammed into the town square, ripping canvas from stalls, sending crates tumbling, and momentarily engulfing the gallows in a blinding, choking vortex of red. People screamed and ran for cover. It was over as quickly as it began, leaving behind a scene of chaos and a fresh layer of dust on everything. It felt like an omen, a warning from the land itself that the world was out of balance. Later that evening, Clara was startled by the sound of the key in her cell door. It was Pike, and behind him stood Ashki Yazi. "The Navajo here says he needs to speak with you," Pike said with a sneer. "Something about tracking. Maybe he thinks you'll tell him where you hid that $50. He laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "You've got 10 minutes. Pike retreated to his desk, leaving them in the dim light of a single lantern. Ashki carried a small, rolled-up piece of buckskin. He crouched down in front of Clara, his presence calm and steady in the suffocating space. "They do not plan to let you live," he said softly. There was no pity in his voice, only truth. "I know," Clara whispered. He unrolled the buckskin on the floor. On it was a map, drawn with charcoal and berry juice. It was not a map of towns and property lines, but of the land itself. Winding lines marked the paths of ancient trails. Symbols denoted hidden springs and sheltered canyons. It was a map of his world, not hers. "My grandfathers walked these paths," he said, his finger tracing a line that wound through the mountains. "When the world is thrown into chaos, when you are hunted, you do not fight the flood. You find the high ground. You follow the path that is hidden from your enemies." He looked up at her. "My people call it hozo, to walk in beauty, in balance. It is not about pretending there is no ugliness. It is about finding the right path through it. It is how we survived." His words were like a drink of cool water after a day in the sun. He wasn't offering an escape plan, not yet. He was offering something more fundamental, a way to endure. Seeing the quiet strength in his face, the profound dignity, Clara felt her own resolve harden. The fear was still there, but it no longer owned her. "My husband, David," she began, her voice gaining strength. "He found out Crook was cheating the miners, stealing from them, endangering them. He kept a record of it all, in a little black notebook. That's what they're looking for. That's why they're doing this to me." She had told no one. Now, she had told him. She had placed her life and David's legacy in the hands of this quiet stranger. Ashki listened without interruption. When she finished, he simply said, "Hozo is also about justice. The world cannot be in balance when such a wrong exists." He met her eyes. "You have a strong spirit, Clara Whitlow. Do not let this cage break it." He rolled up his map and left. The brief connection left an echo of hope in the stale air of the cell. But as the night deepened, so did the danger. Clara had drifted into a restless sleep when a sound jolted her awake. It was the soft scrape of a key in the outer jailhouse door. Not the heavy, confident sound of Pike, but something stealthy, furtive. She sat bolt upright, her blood running cold. She heard a muffled whisper, then the soft click of the office door closing. Someone was inside. She scrambled to the far corner of her cell, trying to make herself small. Footsteps approached, slow and deliberate. A large figure appeared before the bars, his face obscured by a dark bandana. It was Judd, the man from her room. In his hand, he held a short length of rope. Her throat closed with terror. He wasn't here to question her. He was here to finish the job, to make it look like she had given up hope and ended her own misery. A convenient suicide to close the case before the sham of a trial could even begin. Judd fumbled with the keys at his belt, selecting the one for her cell. The metallic rasp as he slid it into the lock was the loudest sound Clara had ever heard. Suddenly, a crash echoed from the alley behind the jailhouse, a sound of splintering wood, followed by the terrified whinny of a horse and the frantic pounding of hooves on the hard-packed earth. Judd froze, key half-turned in the lock. "What in blazes?" he muttered. He hesitated, then moved to the single window in the office, peering out into the darkness. "Just a spooked horse," he grumbled, turning back toward the cell. But the moment was broken. The certainty of his grim task was interrupted. He glanced nervously toward the front door, then back at Clara. He seemed to reconsider, perhaps thinking the noise might have woken someone. With a frustrated growl, he pulled the key from the lock, turned, and slipped out of the office as silently as he had entered. Clara was left shaking, gasping for breath. She knew, with absolute certainty, who had spooked that horse. Ashki. He was out there, watching. He was her unseen guardian. From his hiding place in the deep shadows between the blacksmith's shop and the livery, Ashki watched Judd hurry away from the jail. Judd met up with another of Crook's men, a rat-faced gunman named Finn. "Couldn't do it," Judd hissed, his voice carrying on the still night air. "Some damn horse raised a ruckus. We'll have to wait for the hanging." "Crook won't like it," Finn replied. "He wants this finished, especially with that unscheduled silver shipment heading out before dawn. He wants all eyes on the gallows, not on the trail to Verde." Ashki's eyes narrowed, an unscheduled shipment, unmarked silver. It was the other half of the story in David Whitlow's notebook. Crook wasn't just skimming wages, he was smuggling untaxed ore right out from under the government's nose. He looked from the retreating thugs to the dark window of the jailhouse. The legal path was a dead end. The path of violence was a trap. But the third path, the one his grandfathers had known, was now becoming clear. It was a winding path through chaos, a path of high ground. He knew he could not leave Clara Whitlow to face the rope. The world was too far out of balance, and the time for quiet observation was over. The 48 hours Sheriff Pike had allotted were ticking away, and with every grain of sand that fell, the shadow of the gallows grew longer. ##****, Part 3, Under the Shadow of the Noose, ****. The day of the hanging dawned pale and breathless. The red wind had died in the night, leaving a heavy, expectant silence that was more oppressive than any gale. A crude wooden gallows, hastily constructed, now stood as the town's grim centerpiece. Its new pine timbers gleamed yellow in the morning light, smelling resinously of a life just ended to serve a death. Silas Crook wanted a spectacle, and he got one. His men, led by the rat-faced Finn, moved through the town, knocking on the doors of the miners' shacks and the boarding houses. Attendance was not optional. By mid-morning, the square was filled with a reluctant, shuffling crowd. They stood with their heads bowed and their hats in their hands, their faces a mixture of fear, shame, and a grim, helpless anger. They were men who faced death daily in the dark of the mine. But this public, state-sanctioned killing felt different. It felt like a violation of some unspoken compact, a twisting of the hard justice of the frontier into the cruel theater of a tyrant. May Kincaid moved among them, her face set like stone. She offered a dipper of water here, a quiet word there. "Don't you forget who Thomas Hall was." She'd murmur to one man, "Remember how Michael O'Connell shared his wages when your boy was sick?" She'd say to another, she was planting seeds of memory, of loyalty, reminding them that the woman on that platform was the widow of one of their own, and the names she might speak belonged to their brothers. The men's eyes would flicker, a brief spark of defiance, before being extinguished by the sight of Sheriff Pike and his deputies, their shotguns held loosely but ready. From her cell, Clara could hear the murmur of the crowd and the hammering of the final nails. The sounds were a death knell. Pike had given her a bowl of thin oatmeal and a cup of brackish water. A final meal she couldn't touch. Her fear was a cold, solid thing in the pit of her stomach. Yet, beneath it, a strange calm had settled. It was the calm of a person with nothing left to lose. David's notebook was still safe beneath the floorboards of her room, but its secrets were dying with her. She had one last weapon, her voice, one last duty to bear witness. At noon, Sheriff Pike threw open her cell door. "It's time, Mrs. Whitlow." The walk to the gallows was the longest of her life. The sun was a hammer, the faces in the crowd a blur of sweat and dust. She saw May, who gave her a short, fierce nod of encouragement. She saw Silas Crook watching from the second-floor balcony of his mercantile, a cigar jutting from his mouth, his expression one of supreme satisfaction. He was an emperor in his petty kingdom, and this was his circus. Clara mounted the 13 steps of the gallows, her legs shaking but somehow holding her. The hangman, a beefy man with vacant eyes reeking of cheap whiskey, bound her hands in front of her. The rope, thick and stiff, was lowered over her head. Its rough hemp fibers scratched her neck, and the smell of it, an oily, dusty smell, filled her nostrils, a scent she knew would haunt her last moments. Sheriff Pike stepped forward, holding a piece of paper. He cleared his throat, enjoying his moment of authority. "Clara Whitlow," he began, his voice carrying across the silent square. "You have been found guilty by the laws of this territory of the crime of theft of United States mail. For this heinous act, you are sentenced to be hanged by the neck until—" "That is not my crime," Clara's voice, though trembling, rang out with shocking clarity. The crowd stirred, murmuring. Pike's face flushed with anger. Silence. Prisoner. My crime was being the wife of an honest man, she cried out, her eyes scanning the faces of the miners. My crime was knowing he had proof that Silas Crook is a thief and a murderer. A gasp went through the crowd. On his balcony, Crook took a furious step forward, gesturing to Pike to get on with it. Pike grabbed Clara's shoulder. That's enough out of you. No, she insisted, shaking him off. If I am to die, I will die speaking the truth. You men who work in the dark, you know the truth. You know why your wages are short and your timbers are rotten. You know why good men die. Michael O'Connell, Thomas Hall, William Abernathy. With each name, a shockwave passed through the assembly. These were not abstract victims. They were friends, bunkmates, brothers. The men shifted their weight, their eyes lifting from the dust to meet each other's gaze. The shame was beginning to curdle into anger. Pike, seeing he was losing control, shoved the hangman. Do it now. The hangman moved to the lever. Clara closed her eyes, her heart a wild bird trapped in her chest. She had said her piece. But as the hangman's hand touched the wood, a new element entered the scene. From the south, a thick plume of gray-white smoke began to drift into the square. It carried the pungent, sacred scent of burning sage. It was not a fire. It was a deliberate screen, carried on a breeze that seemed to have sprung from nowhere, obscuring the far side of the crowd. At the same moment, a sound like thunder erupted from the north end of town. A band of a dozen horses, freed from the livery corral, galloped headlong into the square. They were wild-eyed with panic, their hooves churning the dust into a blinding cloud. The crowd broke apart with shouts of alarm, men diving out of the way, the carefully orchestrated solemnity of the event shattering into pure chaos. Amid the pandemonium, another sound was conspicuously absent. Finn, Crook's foreman, ran to the town bell, intending to summon their men from the saloons and bunkhouses. He tugged frantically on the rope, but it came away in his hand, sliced cleanly through. The belfry remained silent. Silas Crook bellowed in rage from his balcony. Get control of them! Shoot the horses! His hired guns raised their rifles, but before they could fire, the sharp crack of a pistol echoed from the doorway of the Golden Slipper. May Kincaid stood there, her shotgun leveled not at a man, but at the large glass jar of pickled eggs on Crook's own store counter. The jar exploded in a shower of glass and brine, spraying the men nearest the door. It wasn't a lethal threat, but it was a clear message. It broke their focus, their line of fire. They spun toward the saloon, momentarily forgetting the chaos in the square. In that perfect storm of distraction, the hangman, acting on his last clear order, pulled the lever. The trapdoor sprang open with a deafening bang. Clara dropped. The world vanished in a sickening lurch, a snap of force against her neck. But the fall was cut short. A sharp, singing sound sliced the air, and the terrible pressure vanished. She was falling, yes, but not hanging. A shape of impossible speed and grace burst through the dust and smoke. Ashki Yazi, mounted on his powerful buckskin horse, had charged the gallows. He had risen in the stirrups, his arm a blur, his long-bladed knife flashing in the sun. In the instant her body had dropped, he had swept past and severed the rope an inch above her head. The Navajo warrior had saved her from the hanging rope. Before her feet could even touch the ground, he leaned down, his arm circling her waist like a band of iron, and pulled her up onto the horse in front of him. The terrified crowd saw only a glimpse of them, a Daine scout and a white woman with a severed noose still around her neck, a phantom emerging from a cloud of dust. "Pike, stop them!" Crook screamed, his voice raw with fury. Sheriff Pike, who had been knocked to the ground by a panicked horse, scrambled to his feet, drawing his revolver. He fired a wild shot that went wide, chipping splinters from a water trough. Ashki didn't even look back. He spurred the horse, not toward the open plains, but into the narrow alley between the assayer's office and the laundry. It was a path no one would expect, a tight squeeze that scraped their legs against the rough adobe walls. They burst out the other side into the back lanes of dry cedar, a maze of sheds and refuse piles. Ashki navigated it with an instinctual knowledge of every twist and turn. Behind them, shouts and disorganized gunfire erupted, but they were already gone, a fleeting shadow against the sun-baked earth. They rode hard for the edge of town, toward the deep, dry arroyo that snaked its way toward the mesas. As they cleared the last shack, Ashki finally looked down at Clara. She was gasping for air, her face pale with shock, her hands clutching his shirt. He reached up and gently, carefully, pulled the frayed end of the rope from around her neck, tossing it to the dust. "Breathe," he said, his voice a low rumble against her ear. "Just breathe." Back in the square, chaos reigned. Sheriff Pike clutched his arm, where a hoof had grazed him. A minor injury that fueled a major rage. $1,000, Crook roared from his balcony, his face purple. $1,000 for the man who brings me the Navajo, and $500 for the woman. The greed in the eyes of his men was instantaneous. The bounty was a fortune. The pursuit would be relentless. Ashki and Clara were no longer just fugitives. They were the quarry in the deadliest hunt the territory had ever seen. Their only hope for survival lay in the labyrinth of canyons ahead, and in the fragile, desperate trust that had been forged in the shadow of the gallows. They had to leave that night, and they could never come back. ******, Part 4, Night on the Stone Ledge, *****. They rode until the horse was slick with sweat, and the last vestiges of the merciless sun had bled from the western sky. Ashki did not follow the main trails, but wove a path through a landscape of broken rock and skeletal junipers, a route known only to the wind and the dying. He pushed the animal, and himself, and Clara, past the point of normal endurance, driven by the knowledge that a bounty of $1,000 would turn every desperate man in the territory into a hunter. When he finally stopped, it was in a place that did not look like a place at all. He dismounted in a narrow, rock-strewn wash and led the horse toward a sheer cliff face that rose hundreds of feet into the deepening twilight. To Clara, it looked like a dead end, another wall in a world that had become her prison. But Ashki ran a hand along a specific fissure in the rock, found a handhold, and began to climb. A narrow, almost invisible trail spiraled upwards, a path a goat would have considered twice. "Come," he said, his voice low but firm. "We will be safe here." The climb was grueling. Every muscle in Clara's body screamed in protest, and her lungs burned in the thin, high-altitude air. Her hands were raw, her dress torn, but she followed him without question, her gaze fixed on his steady, ascending form. He moved with the effortless grace of a man who was part of the rock itself. The ledge he led them to was a deep alcove carved into the cliff by centuries of wind and water. It was perhaps 20 feet deep and 30 feet across, sheltered from above by a massive overhang of sandstone. From here, one could see for miles across the darkening plateau, but the alcove itself was invisible from below. It was a hawk's nest, a fortress of stone. Ashki unsaddled the exhausted horse, rubbing it down with handfuls of dry grass before hobbling it in the deepest part of the shelter where a small patch of tough grama grass grew. The work was methodical, respectful. He was a man who understood his debts, especially to the creatures who served him. As full darkness fell, a profound cold descended from the star-filled sky. Clara huddled against the back wall of the cave, a tremor running through her that had nothing to do with the temperature. It was the aftershock of terror, the body's final, shuddering release of the day's horror. She kept touching her neck, her fingers tracing the raw, red line left by the rope. She could still smell it, that oily, dusty scent of death. She could still feel the sickening drop, the violent snap that had been meant to sever her life. Ashki built a small, Smokeless fire from dry mesquite wood he retrieved from a hidden cache, tucking it deep into the alcove where its light would not be seen. The small flames pushed back the immense darkness and the biting cold. He took a water skin from his saddlebag, unscrewed the cap, and handed it to her. "Drink slowly," he commanded gently. The water was warm and tasted of leather, but it was the most precious thing she had ever tasted. He then offered her a strip of dried meat. She chewed it slowly, the simple act of eating an anchor in a world that had come unmoored. They sat in silence for a long time. The only sounds, the soft crackle of the fire and the whisper of the wind moving across the cliff face. The sky was a spectacle of impossible beauty, a spill of diamond dust on black velvet. So vast and indifferent it made her own small, desperate life feel utterly insignificant. And yet, she had survived. The thought was a revelation, a miracle that was hard to comprehend. "I thought it was the end," she said, her voice barely a whisper. When the floor fell away, "I thought of my husband. David, I was afraid I would die just like him. A name on a list, a story no one would ever hear." Ashki looked at the fire, his chiseled profile thrown into sharp relief by the flickering light. To be forgotten is a great fear. "I used to have such simple dreams," Clara continued, the words spilling out now. "A confession to the night, a small house. Not much, just 2 rooms and a wide porch. A piece of land with enough water for a few apple trees. I always wanted to plant an apple orchard, to watch something grow, season after season, to have roots." She gave a small, bitter laugh. "Now my only hope is to run until I drop." She fell silent, watching him. He was so self-contained, a man who seemed to need nothing from the world. She wondered what drove him, what promises he had made to himself in the quiet of a night like this. As if hearing her thoughts, he spoke, his voice low and resonant. "When I was a boy, my family, my people, we were forced to walk, far from here, far from our sacred mountains. It was a long walk, through snow and heat. Many did not survive. The old ones, the children, they fell by the side of the trail." He paused, his gaze lost in a past she could only imagine. He was not telling a story of self-pity, but stating a fact as solid and unchangeable as the stone around them. "I was young, but I saw things no one should see. I saw good people, strong people, left to the buzzards because they could not keep up. Their stories were lost. Their songs went silent. They died without justice, without balance." He turned his head and his dark, piercing eyes met hers. "I swore an oath then. On the memory of those who fell, I swore I would never again stand by and watch a life be taken without meaning. I would not let another voice be silenced if I had the strength to prevent it." In his words, Clara finally understood the source of his profound stillness, his unwavering resolve. It wasn't the cold detachment of a hardened frontiersman. It was a shield forged in unimaginable loss, a quiet, personal war against the forces of chaos and injustice. He had saved her not out of pity, but out of principle. He had saved her because his soul demanded it. The silence that followed was different. It was no longer empty, but filled with a new, unspoken understanding. They were 2 survivors, from vastly different worlds, who had both been brought to the brink by the cruelty of others. The fire had burned down to a bed of glowing embers. The cold seeped back into the alcove. Clara looked at Ashki, at the quiet strength in his face, the deep lines of sorrow and honor etched around his eyes. She felt a shift inside her, a decision crystallizing in the core of her being. This was not about gratitude. It was not about fear or loneliness. It was about choice. After a day of having all choices taken from her, of being treated like an animal for slaughter, she needed to claim her own humanity, to make an act that was wholly her own. Slowly, she reached out and laid her hand on the small, beaded leather pouch that hung around his neck. She felt the soft buckskin, the coolness of the beads, the faint warmth of his skin beneath it. It felt like touching the very center of him. His eyes widened slightly in surprise. He did not move, did not pull away. He simply waited. "Ashki Yazi," she said, her voice soft but steady, cleared of all its earlier trembling. "Tonight, after you saved me from the hanging rope, I want to give myself completely to you." She saw the question in his eyes, the need to understand. She pressed on, her gaze holding his, willing him to see the truth in her heart. "This is not a payment for a debt," she said, her voice gaining intensity. "You owe me nothing, and I will not be a burden you feel you must carry. This is not because I am afraid or alone. This is because my heart has chosen. Today, they tried to turn me into a thing, an object to be broken for their own purposes. Tonight, I choose to be a woman. With you." He searched her face for a long time, his hawk's gaze probing for any hint of coercion, of fear, of obligation. He saw none. He saw only a woman, strong and unbroken, reclaiming her own soul. He raised his hand and gently covered hers where it rested on his pouch. "Your heart is a strong one. Clara Whitlow," he said, his voice husky. "It has walked through fire today." He paused, his thumb stroking the back of her hand. "Is this the path it truly wishes to walk now?" "It is," she breathed. That was all that was needed. The affirmation of choice, the confirmation of consent. He leaned forward, and his lips met hers. The kiss was not one of hungry passion, but of a profound and trembling tenderness. It was hesitant, gentle, a question and an answer all at once. It tasted of wood smoke, of the arid wind, of a shared and desperate survival. He pulled back the rough wool blanket from his bedroll and laid it on a patch of soft sand near the embers. The rest happened in a world of shadow and soft whispers, of shared warmth against the immense cold of the desert night. There was no haste, no frantic grasping, only a slow, deliberate shedding of the day's horrors, a quiet rediscovery of the solace one human being could offer another. The scene faded, leaving only the quiet sounds of the high desert. The embers of the fire glowed like a constellation of dying red stars. Outside the alcove, the great shimmering river of the Milky Way flowed across the infinite blackness. On a flat stone near the fire, a small, beaded corn pollen pouch lay beside the simple, tarnished silver locket Clara wore, which held a tiny portrait of the husband she had loved and lost. 2 worlds, 2 lives, 2 symbols of faith and memory, resting side by side in the shelter of the ancient rock, under the silent watch of the stars. It was not a beginning born of passion, but a union forged in survival, an act of defiant life in the very face of death. ************************************************************************** Part 5 Silver signs in the stone crevice. ******************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************** clear and sharp, the air scrubbed clean by the high desert wind. The intimacy of the darkness gave way to the stark reality of their situation. They were fugitives with a bounty on their heads, hunted in a land that offered few places to hide. The tenderness they had shared was a fragile ember of warmth in a vast, cold wilderness of danger. Ashki was awake before the first light touched the horizon, his movements economical and precise. He studied the plains below, his eyes tracking the dust devils that danced in the distance. He had heard the words Finn had let slip in the alleyway, an unscheduled silver shipment, the trail to Verde. It was a thread, a single loose thread in the tightly woven fabric of Crook's enterprise. He moves the untaxed silver at night, or in the early morning, Ashki said, breaking the silence as he handed Clara a piece of hardtack. He uses old mule trails through the skeleton canyons. The wagons are too slow and too easily seen. The mules can go where the law cannot. Clara looked at him, seeing the strategist emerge. And you know these trails? It wasn't a question. They were my people's trails long before they were Crook's, he confirmed. The shipment will be guarded, but not heavily. Crook believes no one knows of it. He believes everyone is looking for us near the main roads. A plan began to form, a desperate gamble born of necessity. To simply run was to condemn themselves to a life of looking over their shoulders, to let David's death and her own near murder go unanswered. The notebook in her boarding house room was only one half of the proof. The other half was on that mule train. "We have to intercept it," Clara said, her voice firm. "We need the other ledger." Ashki's gaze held hers. Searching, he saw not a frightened victim, but a partner. "It will be dangerous. If we are caught, he didn't need to finish." "We are already caught. Ashki," she replied, "the only way out is through." For 2 days, they traveled, keeping to the high ground. Ashki taught Clara how to read the signs of the land, how to find water where none seemed to exist, how to move without leaving a trace. She was a quick study, her mind accustomed to the logic of books, adapting to the more ancient logic of survival. The physical hardship was immense, but with it came a sense of purpose that pushed back the fear. She was no longer just running from something, she was moving toward something. On the 3rd morning, Ashki found the tracks he was looking for, the prints of a half-dozen heavily laden mules and 2 riders. They were less than a few hours ahead. He led them to a narrow pass where the canyon walls squeezed the trail into a bottleneck, a place where a few strategically placed rocks could halt an army. Working together, they loosened a large boulder on the cliffside, propping it up with a precariously balanced deadfall branch. It was not a trap meant to harm, but to block. They took up a position on the ledge above, hidden from view, and waited. The sun was high and hot when the mule train appeared. The mules plodded along, their packs heavy with silver ingots wrapped in canvas. As Ashki had predicted, there were only 2 guards: Judd, the hulking brute from Clara's room, and the rat-faced Finn. They rode with a lazy confidence, their rifles resting in their saddle scabbards. When the lead mule was directly below the deadfall, Ashki put his shoulder to the boulder. With a groan of stressed wood, the trap was sprung. The boulder crashed down onto the trail, followed by a shower of smaller rocks and dirt. It was a perfectly executed blockage, completely impassable. Judd and Finn cursed, pulling their horses up short. They scanned the cliffs, their eyes narrowed with suspicion, but they saw nothing. Assuming it was a natural rockfall, common in the canyons, they dismounted. "It'll take us hours to clear this," Judd grumbled. "Crook will have our hides." "Let's check the packs," Finn said, his nervous eyes still scanning the rocks. Make sure none of the mules were hit. This was the moment Ashki had been waiting for. While the men were preoccupied with the mules at the front of the train, he slipped down from the ledge with the silence of a falling shadow. Clara watched, her heart pounding, as he moved toward the last mule in the line, the one that carried the supplies and, he hoped, the paperwork. He reached the mule's pack, his fingers working quickly at the leather straps of a satchel tied to the saddle. But a loose stone shifted under his foot, a small sound that was nonetheless alien in the quiet canyon. Finn's head snapped up. "What was that?" He drew his pistol, his eyes fixing on the rear of the train. Before he could take a step, Clara acted. From her vantage point, she dislodged a small rock, sending it clattering down the cliff face on the opposite side of the trail from Ashki. It was a tiny diversion, but it was enough. Finn spun around, his attention drawn by the new sound. In that split second of distraction, Ashki pulled a thin, leather-bound ledger from the satchel, tucked it into his waistband, and melted back into the shadows of the rocks. "Just a damn rock lizard," Judd said, not even bothering to look up. "Help me with this." Ashki was back by Clara's side moments later, the ledger in his hand. They didn't wait to see more. They retreated deeper into the canyons, putting as much distance as they could between themselves and the smugglers. When they were safe, Clara opened the book. The handwriting was different from the one in David's notebook, but the columns of figures told the same story. One page listed the true weight of the ore, recorded in grams and ounces. The next page, clearly intended for the territorial tax assessor, showed figures that were a fraction of the real amount. It was the missing piece, the undeniable proof of Crook's fraud. A wave of triumph, fierce and sharp, washed over Clara. This was for David. Their victory was short-lived. As they were examining the ledger, a man stepped out from behind a tall spire of rock, a Winchester rifle held at the ready. He was tall, dressed in a dusty but well-made suit, and his eyes were a startling, cold blue. He was not one of Crook's men. He had the unmistakable air of the law. "I'll take that book," the man said, his voice calm and authoritative. "And I'd advise you not to try anything foolish." Ashki moved instinctively, placing himself between the stranger and Clara. "Who are you?" "Special Agent Elias Townsend, Department of the Treasury," the man said, his eyes flicking from the ledger to Ashki's face. "I've been tracking Silas Crook's operation for 6 months. I followed his men from the mine. Saw you trigger that rock slide. Now, I'll ask you one more time. Hand over the evidence." Townsend's gaze was hard, filled with the professional suspicion of a man used to dealing with criminals. He saw a wanted Navajo and a woman who had escaped the gallows, and he drew the obvious conclusion. "You've got it wrong," Clara said, stepping out from behind Ashki. "We're not his partners. We're his victims. That book is the proof. My husband was murdered because he knew what was in that ledger," she continued, her voice ringing with conviction. "And I was nearly hanged to keep me quiet. We're not the ones breaking the law." Townsend hesitated. There was no deceit in her voice. He looked at the ledger, then at the two of them. He had heard about the hanging in Dry Cedar and the strange, chaotic rescue. The official report called it a jailbreak by a savage, but the story he was seeing now was far more complex. Before he could decide on his next move, the sky, which had been a brilliant, cloudless blue, began to change. A strange, yellowish haze appeared on the horizon, and the wind began to pick up, carrying a low, mournful moan. Ashki looked to the southwest, his expression instantly grim. "Sandstorm," he said, his voice tight. "A bad one. We have to find shelter, now." The argument was over. The forces of nature had trumped the laws of men. The yellowish wall of dust was advancing on them at an alarming speed. A roiling, churning beast that would swallow the world. Townsend, a man of the city, was out of his element. He gave a reluctant nod. "Lead the way." Ashki led them into a narrow side canyon, a deep, winding slit in the rock. The wind howled at the entrance, and the world outside vanished in a blinding, stinging maelstrom of sand. The air grew thick and dark, and the roar was deafening. They huddled together in the relative calm of the canyon's depths. 3 unlikely allies bound by a shared enemy and a common storm. They were deep in the canyon when the ground began to tremble. The roar of the wind was joined by a deeper, grating sound from above. The storm had loosened the rocks on the high canyon walls. A section of the cliff face above them fractured, and with a sound like grinding teeth, tons of rock and shale gave way. "Look out!" Townsend yelled. Ashki reacted instantly, shoving Clara and Townsend hard against the far wall of the canyon. They stumbled to safety, but he was not fast enough to save himself. A cascade of boulders and scree crashed down where he had been standing. One large, flat rock pinned his leg, trapping him against the canyon floor. The dust from the rockfall was as choking as the sandstorm outside. Clara scrambled to his side, her heart leaping into her throat. He was conscious, his face pale and tight with pain, but he was trapped. The boulder pinning his leg was massive. She and Townsend could never hope to move it with their bare hands. "My leg," Ashki gritted out. "I think it's broken." Panic threatened to overwhelm Clara. The expert, the survivor, the man who knew this land like the back of his hand, was helpless. But then the days of hardship, the night on the ledge, the defiance at the gallows, it all coalesced into a core of pure, cold resolve. She would not lose him. Her eyes darted around the debris field. She saw a long, sturdy branch from a dead ironwood tree that had been swept down in the slide. a lever. "Townsend, help me," she commanded, her voice cutting through the noise and dust. Together, they dragged the heavy branch toward the boulder. They shoved one end under the massive rock, next to Ashki's leg. Then, using a smaller, flat stone as a fulcrum, they put their combined weight on the other end. The wood groaned. The rock shifted a fraction of an inch, then settled back. It wasn't enough. Again, Clara gasped, her muscles screaming. They tried again, straining with every ounce of their strength. The rock lifted, just barely. Ashki, his face a mask of agony, pulled his leg free. The moment he was clear, they let the branch go, and the boulder crashed back into place. The storm raged on, but in the small pocket of the canyon, there was a profound silence. Clara knelt beside Ashki, her hands gently probing his injured leg. He looked up at her, his usual stoicism replaced by a raw vulnerability. They had saved each other. The roles had reversed. The scales had balanced. They were equals in this wilderness. Later, after they had splinted his leg as best they could and the storm had begun to subside, they took shelter in a small cave. Townsend, his suspicion replaced by a grudging respect, kept watch. In the quiet of the cave, Ashki looked at Clara, his eyes dark with a new kind of pain. "This is the world I have brought you into." "Clara," he said, his voice low and heavy with regret. "A world of rock slides and sandstorms. A world where men hunt you for money, and where the color of your skin makes you a target." He touched her face, his thumb tracing a smudge of dust on her cheek. "You dreamed of an apple orchard, of roots. With me, you will only have the trail. You will only have danger. You will share in the hatred that is meant for me." Clara took his hand, her grip firm and steady. The future was a terrifying unknown. He was right about the danger, about the prejudice she would face as the companion of a Navajo man. But the thought of facing that future without him was infinitely more terrifying. "You didn't bring me into this world, Ashki," she said softly. "Silas Crook did. All you have done is show me how to survive in it." She leaned in, her forehead resting against his. "My roots aren't in a piece of land, not anymore. They're here, with you. Whatever trail we have to walk, we'll walk it together." He closed his eyes, a lifetime of guarded solitude giving way to the simple, profound relief of belonging. Outside, the wind began to die down, and the first rays of a weary sun broke through the clouds of dust, promising a new, uncertain day. ******, Part 6. The day Justice came to Dry Cedar, *****. Returning to Dry Cedar was like walking back into the jaws of a lion. They traveled under the cloak of a moonless night, with Agent Townsend leading the way and Ashki directing their path from horseback, his splinted leg a constant, throbbing reminder of his new vulnerability. Clara rode beside him, no longer a passenger but an equal partner in the desperate venture ahead. They were not sneaking back to hide. They were returning to bring the war to Silas Crook's front door. Their destination was the Golden Slipper Saloon. Townsend went in first, his federal badge a shield of authority that parted the swinging doors. Inside, May Kincaid was serving the last of the evening's drinkers. She looked up as Townsend entered, her expression wary. But when she saw Clara and a limping Ashki follow him into the lamplight, her guarded face broke into a mask of disbelief and fierce relief. "By God," she whispered, rushing to bolt the door behind them. "We all thought you were dead." In the back room, with a bottle of whiskey serving as a seal for their alliance, the plan was forged. They had the ledgers. They had the testimony. What they needed was a stage, a place where the truth could not be dismissed as a rumor whispered in the dark. "Not the sheriff's office, and not the church," May said, her voice raspy with determination. "Crook owns one and would defile the other. It has to be neutral ground." "The train depot," Ashki said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of certainty. He had shifted his weight against the wall. the pain in his leg evident. It is unfinished. It belongs to no one yet. But it represents the future, a future that belongs to all the people, not just one man. It was perfect, a symbol of progress, a public space. Townsend agreed. He had the authority to convene a federal hearing, and he would do it in the most public way possible. May spent the rest of the night moving like a ghost through the town, visiting the shacks of the miners she trusted most, and calling on the town's stooped and weary preacher, Reverend Miller, a man whose faith had been eroded by the rampant injustice he saw every day. The seeds of rebellion she had planted on the day of the hanging were about to bear fruit. The next afternoon, the town of Dry Cedar gathered at the skeletal frame of the new railroad depot. It was a cavernous space, open to the wind, with the raw scent of new lumber and the promise of a world beyond the dusty horizon. A makeshift table was set up on the loading platform, and on it sat 2 leather-bound ledgers and a single, heavy ingot of untaxed silver that Townsend had recovered from the mule train. The townspeople came, drawn by a mixture of curiosity and a desperate, flickering hope. The miners stood in a solid, silent block, their faces grim, their hands calloused and empty. Silas Crook arrived with Sheriff Pike and a dozen of his hired guns, including Finn and Judd. Crook was smiling, treating the entire affair as a piece of amusing street theater. He took a position near the front, ready to watch this pathetic challenge to his authority collapse under its own weight. Townsend began, his voice ringing with the clear, cold authority of the federal government. He laid out the charged systematic tax fraud and smuggling by the Dry Cedar Mining Corporation. He held up David Whitlow's notebook. "This is the journal of an honest man," Townsend declared, "a man who paid for his honesty with his life." Then he held up the second ledger, the one recovered from the mule train. "And this," he said, his eyes locking onto Crook's, "is the book that proves the lie." He called his first witness, Jed, the old miner who had given Clara the notebook, shuffled forward. His voice, weak at first, grew stronger as he spoke of the rotten support timbers, the faulty fuses, the men who had voiced concerns only to be fired or, worse, to suffer accidents. Next came May Kincaid. She spoke of the fear that Crook used as his primary currency, of the threats, of the way he squeezed every last cent from a town that was already bleeding. As she spoke, the mood of the crowd began to shift. The sullen silence was replaced by a low, angry murmur. Crook laughed, a loud, dismissive bark. Lies and hearsay from a disgruntled saloon keeper and a senile old fool. "And what of your star witnesses?" He gestured mockingly at Clara and Ashki, who stood beside the platform. A convicted thief who escaped the gallows and a wanted savage with a bounty on his head. "This is not a hearing, it is a farce." As if on cue, a shout went up from the edge of town. "Fire! The livery stable is on fire!" Heads turned. A column of thick, black smoke was rising into the clear blue sky. It was Crook's masterstroke, a distraction designed to break the hearing, to scatter the crowd, to turn their focus back to the immediate and the chaotic. Panic began to ripple through the assembly. But Ashki was not looking at the fire. His injured leg kept him from pacing, forcing a stillness upon him. And in that stillness, he saw what no one else did. High on the roof of the assayer's office across the square, a single, brilliant glint of reflected sunlight flashed for a split second, then vanished. A rifle scope, a sniper. His eyes scanned the building, and he saw the man's shape, a dark blot against the sky. It was a hired gun named Rafe Judd, a man known for his skill with a long rifle and his complete lack of conscience. He couldn't get there, not with his leg. He grabbed Clara's arm. "The roof," he said, his voice a low, urgent command. "Across the square, a rifleman." Clara's blood ran cold. She saw the shape, the glint. It was aimed directly at the platform, at Townsend. It was a plan to kill the law and blame it on the chaos of the fire. There was no time to warn anyone. No time for anything but action. She remembered the long hours in the canyons, when Ashki, seeing the fire in her, had insisted she learn to use Townsend's spare Winchester. Balance, he had told her, is not just for the soul, it is for the rifle, too. She snatched the rifle that was leaning against the platform. The cold weight of the steel was a shock, but it was a familiar one. She raised it to her shoulder, her cheek pressed against the smooth wood of the stock. She found the sniper in her sights. He was settling in, taking his time, waiting for the perfect shot. She did not aim for the man. She aimed for the instrument of his trade. She took a breath, held it, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle's report was deafening in the sudden lull. Across the square, there was a sharp, metallic crack. Rafe Judd cried out in a mixture of pain and surprise as his rifle's scope shattered, sending shards of glass into his face. The shot had been perfect, an impossible feat of marksmanship that was more effective than a killing blow. It blinded him. It broke his concentration. It sent him scrambling for cover. He was out of the fight. At the same instant, seeing their sniper neutralized, Crook's men made their move, drawing their pistols to intimidate the crowd. "Get back to your homes," Finn yelled. But they had underestimated the town. May Kincaid, who had anticipated this, raised her shotgun and fired both barrels into the air. It was not an attack. It was a signal. It was the bell of revolution. The miners, who had stood for so long with their heads down, looked up. They saw Jed, old and frail, pick up a discarded piece of timber. They saw May, a lone woman, standing defiant. And they saw Clara, the widow they had almost watched hang, now standing with a smoking rifle in her hands. The fear that had held them in its grip for years finally broke. With a roar that was part rage and part liberation, they surged forward. They were not a mob. They were an army, armed with hammers, pickaxes, and the righteous fury of wronged men. They fell upon Crook's hired guns, not with murderous intent, but with the overwhelming force of a community that had finally decided it had bled enough. The fight was short and brutal. Finn was disarmed. Judd was knocked senseless. In the midst of the brawl, Townsend strode directly up to Sheriff Pike. "I have a sworn affidavit from the telegraph operator in Verde," the agent said, his voice cutting through the din, "confirming 3 separate wire transfers from Crook's accounts to yours. It's over. Sheriff," he ripped the tin star from Pike's vest and threw it into the dust. The battle was won, but the final confrontation was yet to come. Silas Crook, his face a mask of disbelief and fury, was cornered. His power had evaporated in the space of a minute. Seeing his escape cut off, he did the last thing a coward could do. He lunged, grabbing Clara, pulling her in front of him like a shield, the cold muzzle of his derringer pressed against her temple. "Everybody back," he screamed, his voice shrill, "or the woman dies for real this time." The crowd froze. Ashki, who had picked up a fallen pistol, stood 20 feet away. He leveled the gun at Crook, his face a granite mask of cold fury. "Put the gun down!" Yazzie Crook shrieked. "I know you won't risk her. Put it down!" Ashki looked at Clara, held hostage, the pistol at her head. He remembered his oath. He would not see another innocent life taken. Slowly, deliberately, he placed the pistol on the ground and kicked it away. Crook let out a triumphant, ugly laugh. He had won. He still had control. But he was wrong. Clara did not struggle. She did not cry. She stood perfectly still. And with her free hand, she reached into the bodice of her dress and pulled out the small, worn, leather-bound notebook, David's notebook. She did not address Crook. She addressed the crowd, her voice shaking but powerful. A bell of judgment that tolled for every man present. "This is my husband's book," she announced, "and these are his last words." She began to read, not the columns of figures, but the names of the dead. Michael O'Connell, died August 4th. Cause collapsed tunnel. Real cause rotted support timbers signed off on by Foreman Finn. To save Mr. Crook $20. Thomas Hall. Died September 19th. Cause fall from a ladder. Real cause the ladder was rotted. He had asked for a new one 3 times. One by one. She read the names, the dates, the real reasons for their deaths. She gave voice to the silenced, gave memory to the forgotten. With every name, she took a piece of power back from the man holding a gun to her head. The crowd was utterly silent, their faces a sea of grief and rage. Crook was no longer a man to be feared. He was just a murderer. His crimes laid bare by the wife of a man he had killed. His shield had become his accuser. His hand trembled. His eyes darted around, looking for an escape that no longer existed. It was in that moment of absolute silence that Agent Townsend stepped forward, his own revolver leveled squarely at Crook's chest. "Silas Crook," he said, his voice booming in the quiet depot. "Your fire is out, your men are beaten, and your reign is over by the authority of the United States government. You are under arrest for fraud, conspiracy, and murder." Crook's face crumpled. The last of his power, the last of his bluster, vanished. His arm went limp, and the derringer clattered to the floor. His men were rounded up and bound. Pike was led away in shame. As the dust settled, Clara looked for Ashki. He stood where he had been, leaning against a post, his face weary but his eyes burning with a fierce pride. Across the depot, Clara saw a flicker of movement on the roof of the assayer's office. The sniper's perch was empty. In the chaos, Rafe Judd had slipped away. A shiver of unease went through her, a premonition that this day's victory had not ended all their troubles, but for now, it was enough. The town was free. Justice, hard won and paid for in blood and courage, had finally come to Dry Cedar. ###*, Part 7, After the Storm. The Green Shoots ****. The silence that fell after Silas Crook was led away in chains was not empty. It was heavy with the weight of years of unspoken fear, and in the quiet that followed, the people of Dry Cedar looked at one another as if for the first time. The smoke still rising from the livery stable was no longer a symbol of chaos, but of a cleansing fire. Before Townsend had even finished securing his prisoners, a bucket brigade had formed. A spontaneous act of unity that was the town's first breath of freedom. Miners and merchants, women and old men, worked side by side, their movements clumsy at first, then finding a rhythm. They were no longer just a collection of individuals scrabbling for survival. They were a community. In the days that followed, Agent Townsend's presence was a catalyst for change. He was a man of the ledger and the law, and he wielded both like a surgeon's scalpel. He officially impounded the Dry Cedar Mining Corporation, its assets frozen, its books seized. He spent long hours with Jed and a handful of other senior miners, painstakingly going through David's notebook and Crook's fraudulent ledgers, calculating years of stolen wages and establishing a fund for the families of the men who had died due to criminal negligence. For the first time, justice in Dry Cedar was not a word shouted from a gallows, but a set of figures written on a page, a promise of restitution. The most immediate change was the town's thirst. The nearly dry well, a source of constant strife, became the focus of their newfound cooperation. The miners, masters of rock and earth, proposed a plan to dig deeper, to blast through the hard pan to a new aquifer they believed lay beneath. A community fund was established, with Townsend releasing a portion of Crook's seized assets as the first contribution. Every family gave what they could. It was no longer Crook's well or the mine's well. It was their well. May Kincaid, her purpose renewed, took a crowbar to the sign above Crook's mercantile. With a screech of protesting nails, the symbol of his economic tyranny came crashing down into the dust. She scrubbed the place from floor to ceiling, exorcising the lingering scent of his greed, and reopened it as May's Provisions and Eatery. It was clean, the prices were fair, and the coffee was always hot. The dark corners where Crook's thugs used to loiter were now filled with tables where families could eat a decent meal. The saloon was still her business, but the eatery became her gift to the town, a place to gather and rebuild. With Pike's tin star gathering dust in an evidence box, the town held a meeting in the still unfinished depot to elect a new sheriff and council. They chose a young, steady-handed miner named O'Connell, Michael's younger brother. As sheriff, a man who understood their loss because it was also his own. Jed, his back a little straighter now, was elected to the council, his quiet wisdom finally given the respect it was due. While the town was healing itself, Clara and Ashki began to build a life. Her small room at the boarding house, with its terrible memories, was no longer a home. With the small amount of restitution she received for David's death and the bounty money, Townsend insisted they accept hazard pay for doing my job for me. He'd said with a rare smile she bought a small, neglected plot of land just outside of town. It was bordered by the creek, the only place where the cottonwoods grew tall and the earth was dark and fertile. Ashki, his leg healing slowly but steadily, became an architect and a builder. He walked the land with Clara, his quiet gaze assessing the flow of the water, the path of the sun, the direction of the winter wind. He chose a spot for their home on a slight rise, sheltered by a stand of old pines. He refused to use the cheap, pre-sawn lumber from Crook's mill. Instead, he taught Clara how to select the right trees from the surrounding forest, how to fell them with respect, explaining that a tree that gives its life for a home should be honored. He built a log cabin, a design from her world, but he constructed it using the principles of his own. Every cut was precise, every notch a perfect fit. Nothing was wasted. The stripped bark became tinder, the leftover branches fuel. He was not merely building a structure, he was creating a shelter that was in harmony with the land it stood upon. It was the physical manifestation of Hozo. One afternoon, the stagecoach brought a carefully wrapped parcel for Clara. Inside were a dozen apple saplings, their roots bound in damp burlap. She had written to her sister months ago, a hopeful letter from a life that seemed a world away. She carried them, one by one, to the patch of rich earth she had tilled by the creek. As she dug her hands into the soil, pressing the earth around the fragile roots, she felt the last of her survivor's guilt fall away. She was not betraying David by planting these trees. She was fulfilling the dream they had shared. She was planting a future, a testament to the fact that life, however brutal, could and would go on. Her grief for him was no longer a wound, but a scar, a part of her history that had made her strong enough to find this new and unexpected happiness. For Ashki, the change was more subtle, but just as profound. He had spent his adult life as a man between worlds, belonging fully to none. He was a scout for the whites, a negotiator for the Dine, but always an observer, his heart carefully guarded. Here, in dry cedar, something was shifting. The miners who had once muttered insults now greeted him with a respectful nod. Yazzie, they'd say, asking his advice on where to find the best clay for chinking their cabins, or how to read the signs of a coming storm. He found himself answering, sharing his knowledge not as a transaction, but as a neighbor. He watched Clara as she tended her small orchard, her face smudged with dirt, her expression one of deep, quiet contentment. He had been drawn to her strength, but he had fallen in love with her resilience. He had feared dragging her into his world of prejudice and danger, but he saw now that they were not entering his world or hers. They were building a new one, together, on this small patch of land. The constant, restless urge to keep moving, to remain unattached, had finally quieted. He had found his high ground, his place of balance, not on a hidden ledge, but beside this woman, on the porch of the home his own hands had raised. He had chosen to belong. A week after the hearing, Agent Townsend prepared to leave. He had a wagon loaded with Crook's ledgers, Pike's confession, and Silas Crook himself. bound for a federal prison where he would never see the Arizona sun again. He stood before Clara and Ashki at the edge of town. "The government will see this through," he said, shaking Ashki's hand. "Then Clara's. The mine will be sold to a more reputable company, and the law will have a permanent presence here. But the law is slow, and it isn't everywhere at once." His eyes grew serious. "I heard from a marshal in the next territory. Rafe Judd, the sniper, was seen in a mining camp called Dust Devil Gulch. He was buying rounds of whiskey and gathering a few unsavory characters. Men loyal to Crook's money. Men who hold a grudge." He looked from Clara to Ashki. "A man like Crook can be caged, but the hate he bred that runs free. Be careful. Be vigilant." The warning hung in the air long after Townsend's dust had settled. The threat was a dissonant note in the town's symphony of renewal, a reminder that evil, once rooted, is not so easily dug out. That evening, they sat on the steps of their unfinished cabin, the walls now high enough to feel like a home. The air was cool and smelled of pine shavings and damp earth. Below them, lights began to twinkle on in dry cedar. They could hear the faint sound of a fiddle from May's eatery, punctuated by bursts of laughter. A dog barked. These were the sounds of an ordinary town at peace. Clara leaned her head against Ashki's shoulder. She looked at the small, fragile apple saplings, their leaves silver in the twilight. They were so small, so vulnerable. They would need years of care, of protection from drought and frost and pests, before they would bear fruit. "Townsend was right to warn us," she said quietly. "He was," Ashki agreed, his arm tightening around her. They knew the storm had passed, but they also knew that other storms would come. Peace was not a destination. It was a garden that had to be tended, a home that had to be guarded. They looked out at the vast, star-dusted horizon, no longer as fugitives, but as settlers. They had put down roots, and they would defend them, together. ###***, Part 8. The road beneath the wide sky, ***. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm of hard work and quiet peace. The walls of their cabin were finished, the roof shingled, and a sturdy porch was added. Facing east to greet the morning sun, the apple saplings by the creek grew stronger, their leaves unfurling to the light. Dry cedar was healing, its scars fading under the warmth of a newfound solidarity. But Townsend's warning was a quiet hum beneath the surface of their new life, a reminder that the past was not yet fully buried. The threat, when it came, arrived on a night of brilliant moonlight. The full moon was a silver dollar in the black sky, illuminating the landscape in an ethereal, ghostly light that flattened shadows and played tricks on the eye. Clara was banking the fire for the night when their horse, hobbled in its small corral, gave a low, nervous whinny. Ashki, who was sitting on the porch step mending a piece of tack, went instantly still. His head came up, his senses tuned to the night. He listened not with his ears, but with his entire being. There was no sound but the crickets and the soft sigh of the wind in the pines. "What is it?" Clara whispered, coming to the cabin door. "Something is out of place," he said, his voice a low murmur. "The crickets have stopped on the south ridge." He rose without a sound, his limp barely noticeable now. He took the Winchester from its pegs by the door and handed it to Clara, from his own saddlebags. He retrieved his knife and a heavy Colt revolver, a weapon he rarely carried but had kept since his scouting days. "Stay inside, bar the door," he commanded. But Clara shook her head. The woman who had huddled in a boarding house room while a thug ransacked her belongings was gone forever. "No," she said, her voice steady. "We do this together. Tell me what to do." He looked at her for a long moment in the moonlight, seeing the unshakable resolve in her eyes. He gave a single, sharp nod. This was their home, their ground. "He will expect me to come for him," Ashki reasoned. "He will expect the warrior. He will not be watching for the gardener." A plan, swift and desperate, was formed in whispers. Rafe Judd was a hunter of men, a creature of ambush and the long shot. He would use the terrain to his advantage. But they knew this land better. They knew every rock, every wash, every shadow. Clara slipped out the back of the cabin, the heavy rifle in her hands, and circled around toward the creek, keeping to the deep shadows of the cottonwoods. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs, but her hands were steady. She was the lure. Ashki moved in the opposite direction, a ghost melting into the moon-drenched landscape, circling wide to come up behind the rocky outcropping that overlooked their cabin, the perfect sniper's perch. Clara reached the small cluster of boulders near her apple orchard, the place where she often sat in the afternoons. She made her movements deliberate, just loud enough to be heard. She broke a twig underfoot. She let the moonlight catch the barrel of her rifle for a moment as she leaned it against a rock. She sat down, presenting herself as a clear, unsuspecting target. The wait was agonizing. The silence stretched, pulled taut. Then, a voice slithered out of the darkness from the rocks above. "Evening, Mrs. Whitlow. Or should I call you Mrs.? Yazzie now." Rafe Judd stepped into the moonlight, his face a patchwork of scars from the shattered scope, his eyes burning with a venomous hatred. He held a pistol, aimed squarely at her. "I've come to collect a debt," he snarled. "Crook paid well, but he didn't pay me for the piece of my face you and your savage took. Tonight, I settle the account myself." Clara remained seated, her hands in her lap. "You're a fool. Rafe, it's over. Crook is gone." "It's not over until I say it is," he spat. "He's going to get what's coming to him first." He gestured with his pistol toward the cabin. "Then he'll watch you die, just like you were supposed to in that square." Clara's mind raced. Ashki was not yet in position. She had to buy him time. "You think killing us will change anything?" she said, her voice rising slightly, projecting into the night. "The whole town knows the truth. Sheriff O'Connell knows. Killing us will only bring the marshals down on you for good." Judd laughed, a dry, rasping sound. "There won't be anyone left to tell the tale. I'm not leaving witnesses this time." He took a step closer, his intentions clear, but as he moved, a shadow detached itself from a deeper shadow behind him. Ashki. He had moved with impossible silence, and now he stood between Rafe and his path of retreat. Rafe spun around, his eyes wide with shock. He fired his pistol, a panicked, wild shot that whizzed past Ashki's head and ricocheted off a boulder, before he could fire again. Ashki launched himself forward. The two men crashed together in a brutal, hand-to-hand struggle. This was not a fight of strategy or skill. It was a raw, primal battle of strength and desperation. Rafe was bigger, fueled by a mad rage. Ashki was quicker, driven by a cold, protective fury. They rolled in the dust, trading blows that landed with sickening thuds. A shot rang out as the pistol was knocked from Rafe's hand. Clara scrambled for the Winchester, her sights finding the two struggling forms. She couldn't get a clear shot. She watched in horror as Rafe gained the upper hand, his fingers closing around Ashki's throat. Ashki's face began to contort, his struggles weakening. Then, Ashki's hand, which had been scrabbling in the dirt, found the handle of his fallen knife. With a final, desperate surge of strength, he drove the blade upward, not into Rafe's flesh, but plunging it deep into the hard-packed earth right beside Rafe's head. The message was clear. I could have. The shock of the near-fatal blow, the cold steel so close to his temple, broke Rafe's will. The fight went out of him. Ashki threw him off and rose to his feet, breathing heavily. He stood over the defeated man, his chest heaving, his knife still quivering in the ground. For a long, terrible moment, he looked down at Rafe, and Clara saw the ancient warrior in his eyes. The man forged in the long walk. The man who knew how to finish a fight. Every instinct screamed for him to pull the knife from the earth and end the threat forever. But then he looked over at Clara, and at the cabin behind her, and at the small, sleeping town in the distance, and he made a choice. He reached down, not for his knife, but for the dazed and whimpering Rafe Judd. He hauled him to his feet. "It is finished," Ashki said, his voice ragged. He shoved the man toward the trail that led to town. "Justice is not my hands. It is the law." He had chosen the future over the past. He had chosen community over vengeance. The next morning, the world felt new. A soft rain had fallen just before dawn, washing the dust from the air and leaving the scent of wet earth and pine. Small jewels of water clung to the leaves of the apple trees. Sheriff O'Connell had taken Rafe Judd into custody, and the final shadow of Crook's reign had been lifted. In the bright, clean light of the new day, Clara and Ashki stood before Reverend Miller on the porch of their cabin. May was there, and Jed, and a handful of the miners. It was not a formal church wedding. Reverend Miller, his faith renewed by the town's courage, spoke not of sin and obedience, but of partnership and shared burdens. They exchanged simple vows, promises to stand by one another, to build a life on the foundation of trust and respect they had forged in fire. After the small gathering had departed, Clara and Ashki stood alone by the creek. The town's ceremony had sealed their bond in the eyes of the community, but this moment was just for them. Clara held out her hand. In her palm was a small amount of fine, yellow corn pollen she'd carefully ground herself. "For life," she said softly. "For sustenance. For our home." Ashki accepted it, his calloused fingers gentle against hers. He then dipped a tin cup into the clear, flowing water of the creek and held it out to her. "For truth," he said, "for clarity, for our journey." They shared the water, a silent communion under the wide, open sky. The morning sun, their only witness, broke through the clouds, bathing them in a warm, brilliant light. Later that day, they sat on their finished porch, watching the horizon. A new sound reached them, a distant chugging, a piercing whistle that echoed off the mesas. On the horizon, a plume of dark smoke marked the approach of the first train into Dry Cedar. The iron rails had finally arrived. They watched as the locomotive, a great, black beast of progress, pulled into the new depot. It brought with it mail and goods and strangers. It brought the future. The West was changing, shrinking. The wild, lawless freedom of the frontier was giving way to the ordered, interconnected world of the railroad. Clara leaned her head on Ashki's shoulder, her hand resting on his. Their own road had been as difficult and uncertain as the laying of those tracks. "The night you saved me from the hanging rope," she said, her voice filled with a quiet wonder. "I chose you." She turned her head, her gaze meeting his, her love a steady, unwavering light. And this morning, under the wide sky, we continue to choose each other. Ashki looked from the train to his wife, to the small, sturdy cabin and the hopeful orchard. The road ahead would have its own trials, its own storms. But here, together, they had found their place of balance. They had found their home. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We'd love to know where you're tuning in from, so please drop a comment below and let us know what part of the world you're in. It's always amazing to see how far these tales travel. If you enjoyed this journey, please consider subscribing to our channel, Wild West Tales, and give this video a like. And if you really want to help us out, hit that hype button to help share this story with more listeners just like you.